Joining me now for some bipartisan analysis on these poll results is Dr. Jay Barth, Professor Emeritus at Hendrix College, and Robert Coon with Impact Management Group. Robert and Jay, thank you very much for being with us. Let's just dive right into it. And I want to go first with Governor Hutchinson's job approval numbers, as well as the legislature's job approval numbers. He's more popular than them. Is that a surprise, Robert?
No, I don't think so. I think you got a couple factors there. I think the governor has been in office for a while. His numbers have always been very strong, usually between the high 50s and low to mid 60s, occasionally higher. He's well known, well established. There's not very many people, less than 2% of the ones we surveyed, that don't know who he is. And so people kind of have their opinions there. The legislature is a little different just because they deal with so many issues. There's a little bit of something there for everybody to like and a little bit of something for everybody to not like. And so probably more of a mixed bag in general of what people are familiar with coming out of the legislature.
Jay, for your political party, the Democrats, this week's 3-day legislative session may result in those numbers coming down a little bit in the legislature. What do you make of the dichotomy between Governor Hutchinson and the legislature, and why do you think he's more why he has a higher job approval than them?
Yeah, I mean, I think Arkansans tend to like their pragmatic governors, and I think that he is very much that. We had seen in May that Governor Hutchinson's numbers had dipped a bit. We've really seen a bit of an improvement this time, and the bulk of the improvement is with Republican voters. There was a lot of lukewarmness to the governor after that very conflictual legislative session in the spring, but he has had a comeback with those voters in particular, and he's still very solid with Democrats and very solid with independents. The legislature is actually is in a little bit better shape than they were back in the spring. This, of course, was done before the most current special session, or the continuation of the regular session, excuse me. But they had a failed special session, of course, just before school started, as they considered mask mandate alterations. But they're kind of blah with the electorate, and I think that's kind of Democrats particularly hostile to the legislature. And we see some subgroups of voters, especially younger voters of color, and some other voters who are really pretty negative to the legislature. So they are a more polarized group for voters. The governor is anything but polarized. He is solid across the board.
Yeah, that's a good way to put that. All right, let's talk about two legislative related issues, but let's do them separately. So let's go first with there's a constitutional amendment that the legislature has already referred that would allow them to call themselves into a special session if voters were to approve this. It was 40% for, 38% against, but we saw the support and the opposition was pretty soft in all of this. So I want to get both of you to give me your take on that. Jay, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room to define this issue for both sides. I mean, I think that a lot will depend upon the degree to which there is an active campaign, either for or against, and then how successful they are in getting the message out. I think that there are institutionalists, those who kind of care about maintaining the balance of power, who are concerned about this kind of continual drift of empowerment by the legislature, really leaving an already pretty powerless governor even less powerful, in that the legislature could really call themselves into session at any point and start making laws. But a lot will depend upon if anybody cares enough about this issue to invest any money. But if somebody does, they can really shape this, because we've got a lot of folks who don't know, and then a lot of softness otherwise. So I think to be determined, this thing could go either way. I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing who cares enough about this issue to invest in it, but I may be wrong, and I would really be curious Robert's thoughts on that. Who would really step up to put some money behind this initiative?
Yeah, Robert, what's your take?
Yeah, well, I think there's definitely the group that cares the most about it is the members of the legislature. Whether that means that there's money easily had to put into it, I don't know that that's the case. I think my views on this question. I think voters really were shooting from the hip on taking this question, and probably there's probably not a whole lot of institutional knowledge there of how the current process even works to get into a special session. I just don't think that's certainly not kitchen table conversation. I don't think people really, unless they've been spending time reading the Constitution in their lunch break, are really very informed on how that process works. So I think that's part of why you see a lot of probably fors, probably against, and really you had 22% that just straight up said they didn't know, and that was the third largest group. So I think Jay's right. To really move the needle one way or the other, you probably need, some paid efforts there. But I do think that members of the legislature, after going through what we've gone through over the past, 18 months, 20 months, they feel very, very strongly that they need the ability to do this. And so I do think you'll hear them saying that back home on social media, really at county committee meetings and things like that. So I do think the message will get out, but obviously that's different than a paid media campaign.
I would be surprised to see if maybe the Common Ground Arkansas group, this independent group that State Senator Jim Hendren has formed, may weigh in on this particular issue. This may be one of those good government, bad government issues that they want to define themselves on. So we'll see if that happens. Just to both of your points there too, only 40% were either probably for or strongly for, and the strongly for I think was a single digit number. So 60% either don't know or were definitely against. So it kind of starts from a position of failure, I guess. We'll see if it moves beyond that. All right, another issue, Texas. We tested the Texas abortion law that is got this injunction, was allowed to stay in place from the U.S. Supreme Court. We wanted to see if there would be support from Arkansans for a similar type piece of legislation in Arkansas. And where we saw soft numbers in that other issue we just talked about, these are strong numbers here. Robert, I'm going to let you go to this issue first. If similar legislation were introduced in Arkansas, would you support or oppose its passage? It was 46 to 49 for and against, but 35.5% was definitely support. 42.5% definitely opposed. Why such strong opinions?
Well, I think abortion, unlike the constitutional amendment on the legislature calling them back, abortion is an issue that most people are familiar with. They already have formulated an opinion on, and they know how they feel about it. I think that is clearly what leads to, some strongly held beliefs on both sides. I think the issue with this particular law is that it does have a few extra ornaments on the tree. Obviously, they trimmed the number of weeks back to 6, which I think, some media coverage has, covered the fact that that's, pretty early in a pregnancy, and that may have its own, functional difficulties of being enforced. I think obviously it doesn't have exceptions for rape and incest. I think voters typically look for, there's a section of voters that looks for those exceptions. And so I think that probably opens the door a little bit beyond just something, that would accommodate those issues. And then you have the complication of that, private right of action for someone to sue someone who participates, which could be, anywhere from a doctor or the Uber driver that drives somebody to a clinic. I think that has gotten some attention too, that might be putting some doubts in people's minds. So I do think the results on this question are different in being specific to the Texas law versus what a straight up 6-week abortion prohibition would be. I think they're probably slightly different.
All right, Jay.
Yeah, I think Robert's totally right. I think one thing that was really telling on this one, there was the percentage of folks who didn't have an opinion was tiny on this, which does suggest for an issue, this one really has broken through. The national conversation about this law really has broken through. I think in our previous polling we've done, of course, we have not polled this exact issue of 6 weeks exactly without any exception before. But Arkansas, it has shown itself to be a pretty pro-life state in recent years. And I think it is the private right of action that really does make this a very different legal game. And I think probably makes more voters pretty queasy about this. It really is kind of a wild, wild west kind of action around this issue. But, what I see in these numbers is that if the legislature were to spend a lot of time on this, it would be a problem along the lines of what they had in the spring, where they were spending time on issues that were not front and center for Arkansas voters. And I think the legislature does have to be careful if they start heading in this direction of trying to do the same thing here.
All right, I'm going to throw this question up for grabs with you. I'm just making a correlation here. So the Arkansas version of a Texas abortion law, 46.5% support, 49.5% oppose. When we asked about the approval, disapproval of the job performance of the U.S. Supreme Court, 45% approve, 48.5% disapprove, almost a mirror number there. Do you think there's any correlation there? I'll throw that one up for grabs.
I think there is some, unquestionably. I think, the one area where there's been a lot of attention in the Supreme Court in the last few months is this Texas abortion case and their inaction in putting it on hold. So I think there's some. I don't know if it's an exact number. It does appear when you look at the crosstabs that the same groups who have real concerns about this law also tended to be decidedly opposed to the activities, the performance of the Supreme Court.
See that Robert J. did his homework. Did you do your homework?
I don't know that I necessarily agree. I mean, I think there could be some correlation there. I think the greater correlation on the Supreme Court question is more so to like the supporter or oppose on the legislature. I just think the Supreme Court is not reliably giving everybody what they want all the time, and so people are usually sometimes happy with them, sometimes not happy with them, and it kind of just makes them a mixed bag, just like the legislature.
All right, let's take a quick commercial break. We're going to come back with more with Robert Coon and Jay Barth right after this word from our sponsors. Welcome back to the program. We're talking about our latest Talk Business and Politics-Hendrix College survey of 916 Arkansas likely voters. I'm with Dr. Jay Barth and with Robert Coon for a little bipartisan analysis. Let's move on to some other questions from the poll. We're seeing a lot of conversations with the state legislature over all things COVID-19, not as much on congressional redistricting as we might thought. We asked a couple of interesting questions here. I want to get your different takes on this. Jay, I'll begin with you. Let's talk about this question we asked about mask mandates. 29% said there should be a statewide mask mandate for schools. 46% said it should be local control, and only 22.5% said that this should be something that the state should mandate, that there should be a prohibition on these masks. Were you surprised by those results?
Perhaps a bit, probably not where the pluralities were, but the 22% who agreed in essence with Act 1002, which has been the source of course, litigation that got some airtime at the state Supreme Court this week as well. I think that I was surprised by how small that number is. It's certainly the folks who've spoken out against it have been loud and vociferous at the legislative hearings as well as at school board hearings around the state, and so that has been, loudness does not equal where the bulk of the public really is. I think I was a bit surprised. I think that the governor has gotten this one right. It's where the citizenry is, and I think this is probably an area where the legislature is just out of sync with where the bulk of Arkansans are. Now, there's some big differences around the state. Urban voters and suburban voters much more pro-mask, no matter which category they are in. It's rural voters that tend to be more anti-mask, and of course, most legislators do represent partially or totally rural constituents.
I would say you said the governor got it right. He got it right after he got it wrong first. If he's following public opinion, I'll point that out there.
He has gotten it right in the debate over the litigation.
All right, Robert, what do you think on this number? Did that loud, vociferous group that Jay is mentioning, did that surprise you that they're not as big as they seem to be?
It didn't necessarily surprise me, but it is interesting to kind of see what the numbers look like. And again, this is one survey, and you might get a slightly different result, or if you ask again or ask it a different way. I do think what people have seen on their local news of people protest en masse at school board meetings and things like that is not necessarily, at least according to this survey, reflective of how the broader electorate views this issue. It certainly reflects how a portion of it does, but just because that group is the loudest and the most active to show up at a meeting doesn't mean that they're the majority. And I think sometimes that gets lost. I will say that, the group of the local districts decide is almost a majority. It's really close. But what was most interesting to me is that when you kind of peel back the layers of the onion among Republicans, I believe 50% of Republicans said the local districts should decide. Republicans in recent years have kind of gotten blasted for, not being for local control. I think, at least at the legislature, I think this shows you that the people, they recognize local control as an important value. Republicans recognize its important value to their party, and they're conveying that in the results of this survey.
All right. And of course, the Arkansas Supreme Court upheld Judge Fox's decision to allow that injunction to stay in for the mask mandate. So the policy is what it is right now. All right. Another question, Robert, I'll come back to you first on this one. Should companies be allowed to mandate vaccines for their employees? Should they be prohibited from doing that? 51% said they should be allowed. 43% said they should not be allowed. And that has been the subject of a lot of legislative debate this week. Some of these legislators may be reading this as too close to call. What's your take on why we see the legislative action that we see and what we see in this poll's result?
Well, I think the big difference here is obviously you got a majority of people saying corporations should have the ability to do that. I think it's kind of like the mask question. When you kind of look at the subgroups amongst Republicans, this number changes dramatically. I think it was somewhere along the lines of 68% or somewhere in there of Republicans that feel like corporate mask mandates should be prohibited. So if you're a member of the legislature, it depends on whether or not you're taking a wider view of the electorate as a whole, or if you're more concerned about your party base and how they view the issue. And so it's definitely an issue that's got a lot of feelings to it. Quite frankly, I think it's got a lot of confusion to it. I remember in recent years, we've seen people on social media get fired for wearing an inappropriate T-shirt from their employer, or because they said something or did something or acted out on an airplane and they got fired. People kind of say, "Oh, they violated my constitutional rights." Well, your employer has the right to terminate you for those things. Your freedom of speech doesn't necessarily go with you on company time. You don't get to show up in your company wearing an offensive T-shirt. They can terminate you for that. So I think there's a lot of people that kind of confuse the fundamental constitutional rights that we have with our contractual rights with our employers and vice versa. So I think that's part of this as well.
And Arkansas is a right to work state. Jay, what's your take on that question and the results that we saw there? And I think Robert aptly points out that Republicans overwhelmingly in the 43% category there of thinking it should be prohibited.
Yeah, I think Robert's totally right in terms of how it plays out in the political dynamics of Arkansas. I do think that in the coming weeks, I think the story of the fall was about the battle over mask mandates. Where we are now with President Biden's executive orders and on vaccine mandates in health centers and other places, we're going to see this play out. Of course, Tyson, probably the largest employer in Arkansas that has mandated vaccines. And so this issue is probably not going away. I think Robert's totally right in terms of the dynamics of the legal dynamics around it. It's probably ultimately a losing position because private employers do have a lot of rights in this space. The thing that's really striking to me is how divided the Republican Party is on this between business Republicans and kind of Trumpist populist Republicans. This divide the chasm just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and it reaches a point where you wonder on some of these fundamental issues, how does this political party kind of hang together over the long haul?
Well, Robert, I feel like I should give you a chance to respond to that.
I think to some degree there is a growing shift between certain members of the Republican side that, the populism is kind of butting heads with the more traditional business-oriented minded Republican. Although I will say that, just week in the legislature, obviously there's a whole host of bills that were filed on vaccines. I think the one that appears to be, getting consensus is one that kind of started in a more populist frame and has been amended to try to account for the concerns that businesses have about their rights. It's really become more of a version that I think that both people on both sides of the Republican caucus are looking at and thinking that is more reasonable now than where it started. And so that doesn't mean that just because there is kind of this rift that they still can't come to agreement, at least inside the Republican tent, on what to do on these issues.
All right. And hey, Jay, those Republicans may steal your union voters if you're not careful, all you Democrats there. So, all right, last question. The Great Pumpkin. We asked about support or opposition to the elimination of the personal income tax in Arkansas. This is an idea floated by Attorney General Leslie Rutledge, although there are others who have picked this up too. This would eliminate the personal income tax in Arkansas if it gets on the ballot in 2022. Her version gets it done by 2030. We didn't put that in the question, but still, eliminating the tax overall, 54% support, only 25.5% opposition. When we asked the follow-up question of, here would be some of the consequences if that happened, you still have about half of those that support or don't know supporting this. And so, Jay, I'll give you the first word on this one, and Robert, I'll give you the last word. Is this good public policy? What are we seeing in these numbers to perhaps affect something that could be a major impact on the state budget?
Yeah, it could be a huge monster impact on the state budget. I think you can look at this either, half full or half empty. I mean, on one level, clearly there's a lot of anti-tax sentiment in the Arkansas electorate. So that, and it's big, and it is somewhat sustained even when you ask a follow-up. That said, when you put together those who have concerns from the get-go about this policy with those who support it initially but then are peeled off because of the concerns about other taxes or cuts to services, then that is a working majority on the other side. And so ultimately, like any good public policy debate, it's going to be which side has the most resources and most effectively argues their point. And I think that it's a close call right now where Arkansas is going. But I do think as the costs of a policy change like this become more obvious and more personal, because individuals will start having key services that are important in their lives eliminated or partly eliminated as a result of a policy change like this, then I think it probably gets to be more real, and the opposition grows as much as folks like it on its face.
Right now, it's a pretty good issue to hang your hat on if you're running for office, though, isn't it, Robert?
I think it's a good issue to hang your hat on if you're living in a soundbite. And I think that, there's candidates that, a wide range of them. And that doesn't mean they truly don't believe that it's the right call for the state, because they very probably do. I think that in a soundbite, abolishing the income tax and looking at neighbors in Tennessee and Texas where they don't have an income tax, those states demonstrate that it can be done. But I think really the actual decision to do that is going to have some sort of consequence for the state, whether that's a significant reduction in spending, revenue being generated through some other tax vehicle. Some would argue with some growth. Obviously, I don't think you can get all of that back just given the percentage of our overall budget that the income tax makes up, or some combination of tax increases and revenue reductions or spending reductions. I think this kind of question is kind of like, hey, would you like a free pizza? Most people are going to say, sure, I'd like a free pizza. But if you ask them, if you take the free pizza, you got to pay me $6 a month for the rest of the year, they might not want the free pizza anymore. So it just depends on what layer you're operating on. If you're just talking about the free pizza or just talking about the upside, I think you just get a different, as we've seen with the results, you do start to lose people once they understand the potential consequences. I still think there's a pretty solid base of support as you kind of dissect the numbers. I think somewhere around 37% would be for it, despite the potential consequences. For me, that says, if you're running a campaign for this, you got a pretty strong base of support of people that say, I'm for it no matter what happens. But it also means that the other side has the ability to move the needle by talking about the budgetary consequences. And so for me, this one's probably more of a toss-up at this time with messaging opportunities for people on both sides.
That free pizza may give some lawmakers some indigestion. That may be the consequence for some of them there.
They can't take it from a lobbyist, though. They can't be given the free pizza.
All right. Republican Robert Coon, Democrat Dr. Jay Barth, thank you both for your insight. Great stuff, and we appreciate you very much.
Thanks for having me.
All right. We're back to wrap up right after this.